It started as one of those ordinary afternoons when the sun hung lazily in the sky, the kind of day when nothing seemed capable of disturbing the peace of our small suburban neighborhood. Yet beneath that calm surface tension had been brewing for weeks because of one particular woman, the self proclaimed queen of the HOA, who everyone had nicknamed Karen. Behind her back, though, she wore the title unknowingly and almost proudly through her entitled actions. She had a reputation for inserting herself into everyone's business, from dictating what color shutters people could use to measuring lawns with a tape measure and leaving fines in mailboxes when grass grew half an inch beyond her liking. And my wife, a strong, disciplined woman with a quiet military past she rarely spoke about, had clashed with Karen more than once after refusing to bend to ridiculous HOA rules that Karen tried to enforce without proper authority. For instance, Karen had demanded that we paint our porch beige because it clashed with the aesthetic harmony of the street, but my wife had coolly reminded her that property law was on our side, and we had legal exemptions from HOA oversight since our house sat on a parcel technically excluded from the development's covenants, which only enraged Karen further as she saw it as a personal challenge to her power. So for days, she had been prowling around the street, staring at our property, taking pictures with her phone, and whispering to other neighbors about how we were ruining the neighborhood. Yet my wife and I simply laughed it off until that particular afternoon when everything took a violent turn that none of us saw coming. I was inside the house fixing a loose window hinge when I heard the sharp echo of angry voices outside. My wife's calm tone rising in response to Karen's screeching demand that we remove the small American flag hanging near the porch steps because it wasn't in compliance with community guidelines, even though, again, we weren't subject to them. And I rushed toward the door just in time to see the moment that changed everything. Karen, red-faced and trembling with rage, actually shoved my wife backward while she stood on the top step of the porch, the sudden push catching her completely off guard, sending her tumbling down 3 wooden stairs and landing hard on the concrete walkway with a sickening thud that knocked the breath out of me as much as it did her, and for a split second the world seemed to freeze as neighbors gasped and peered through blinds, some recording on phones, while I bolted forward, my heart hammering in my chest, kneeling beside my wife to check if she was okay, fury rising inside me like a wildfire because the audacity of this woman putting her hands on my wife was beyond any line of decency, beyond any petty HOA squabble. My wife grimaced, struggling to catch her breath, but even in pain, she squeezed my hand and whispered for me not to lose control. Not yet, because she knew what was coming, and as I helped her sit up, Karen, instead of showing remorse, actually crossed her arms smugly and said, "Maybe now you'll learn to respect authority," which was the exact moment the distant rumble of engines grew louder from the end of the street, a sound unmistakable to anyone who had ever spent time around military vehicles, a sound that vibrated through the pavement and shook the windows, a sound that turned heads as 5 massive convoys, olive drab, armored trucks, tactical Humvees, and black SUVs with tinted windows rolled in formation into our quiet suburban cul-de-sac, their presence so jarring that every curtain on the block flew open as neighbors stood frozen, jaws dropping, realizing this wasn't some neighborhood spectacle anymore, but something much, much bigger. I stood slowly, towering over Karen, who was now paling as realization crept across her face, because what she didn't know, and what she had just triggered, was that my wife's military past wasn't just some minor service history. She had been a high-ranking officer with direct ties to active command, and those convoys weren't random. They were scheduled to meet her that very day for a classified training coordination she had agreed to oversee in a temporary advisory role, which meant Karen, in her arrogance, had just physically assaulted a decorated military officer minutes before her commanding colleagues arrived. And as the lead Humvee screeched to a halt, soldiers in full tactical gear dismounted with precision, scanning the area while one of the black SUVs rolled up behind, its door swinging open to reveal a stern-faced colonel stepping out, his eyes locking immediately on my injured wife, and in that instant the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood shifted from suburban squabble to federal-level seriousness, the kind of seriousness that made Karen take a stumbling step back, her arrogance draining away as the colonel barked for medics who rushed forward with a stretcher, checking my wife with practiced efficiency while armed soldiers fanned out, establishing a perimeter around the house as though this quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a military forward operating base. And the sight of it all, the disciplined soldiers, the armored vehicles, the neighbors filming in stunned silence, made Karen's face contort between disbelief and growing fear, because in her misguided attempt to assert HOA authority, she had just poked a hornet's nest that was far beyond anything she could comprehend. The neighborhood had gone completely silent except for the rhythmic pounding of boots as soldiers spread into positions, their movements crisp and calculated, turning the peaceful cul-de-sac into something that looked like a forward deployment zone, and I could see neighbors clutching their phones, whispering into them, some probably dialing 911 out of sheer panic, because they had never seen anything like this, while Karen stood rooted in place, her mouth opening and closing like a fish as she tried to make sense of the fact that 5 full convoys of armed military personnel had just arrived not 2 minutes after she shoved my wife down the stairs. My wife, ever the disciplined officer, even while grimacing from the pain in her back and shoulder, refused the stretcher at first, insisting on standing with my support, and the medics reluctantly agreed but stayed nearby, watching carefully as she squared her shoulders and looked the colonel dead in the eye, their shared nod a silent exchange of understanding that told me this wasn't their first rodeo together, while Karen, still too arrogant to realize the magnitude of her mistake, suddenly found her voice and snapped. "You can't just bring all this equipment in here without HOA approval. This is private property," which was the single worst sentence she could have uttered, because in an instant the colonel turned toward her, his steely gaze narrowing as if he were addressing a cadet caught lying during inspection, and he asked in a cold, precise tone, "Did you just put your hands on this officer?" His words carrying so much weight that the entire street seemed to hold its breath, and Karen stammered, trying to backpedal, muttering something about neighborhood discipline and maintaining order while pointing at the flag on our porch as though that somehow justified physically assaulting someone. But before she could finish, the colonel barked, "At ease," and 2 soldiers stepped forward, their presence alone enough to silence Karen as they demanded she stay put, one of them pulling out a tablet to begin recording her statements for an incident report, because when you lay your hands on a decorated officer, it isn't just a petty neighborhood squabble, it's potentially a federal crime. My wife finally spoke, her voice steady though her breathing was still labored, and she said, "This woman has been harassing us for months, trying to enforce HOA rules we aren't subject to, and today she crossed the line into assault." And that statement alone triggered the colonel to call in a JAG officer who stepped out of the SUV in immaculate uniform, a legal advisor who immediately began scribbling notes, his presence making Karen pale even more, because now it wasn't just soldiers, it was lawyers, paperwork, and the possibility of criminal charges stacking against her. Still, in her twisted sense of superiority, Karen puffed up her chest and yelled, "This is harassment. You can't intimidate me with your costumes and trucks. I'll have the police shut this whole circus down." And as if the universe had timed it for dramatic effect, sirens wailed in the distance, a couple of local police cruisers screeching into the cul-de-sac, officers jumping out with confusion written all over their faces as they took in the sight of armed soldiers, armored vehicles, and a furious HOA president standing in the middle of it all. The lead police officer, trying to remain professional, walked up cautiously and asked what was going on. But before Karen could open her mouth, the colonel stepped forward, producing his credentials, speaking in a clipped tone that made it clear he outranked anyone in the vicinity, and after explaining the situation, that a civilian had assaulted a decorated officer on private property and that military personnel were present by direct authorization. The officer's entire demeanor shifted, his spine stiffening as he realized this was way out of his league, and he immediately instructed Karen to sit down on the curb while he conferred with the colonel, which only made her explode with shrieks about how this is MY neighborhood. "I'm in charge here. You all have to listen to me." Her voice cracking with hysteria as more neighbors gathered, some recording every second, others whispering about lawsuits, arrests, and how Karen had finally gone too far. Meanwhile, my wife, still clutching my arm for support but standing tall, gave a subtle order of her own, asking one of the soldiers to retrieve her personal bag from inside the SUV, and when he returned, she unzipped it, pulled out a sleek folder stamped with official insignia, and handed it to the local police officer, who scanned the documents, his eyebrows rising higher with each page, before he turned to Karen and said in a firm voice, "Ma'am, you need to understand that this isn't an HOA matter anymore. This is federal." And the weight of that single word, federal, seemed to finally break through her delusion, her face draining of color as murmurs rippled through the crowd of neighbors who were now watching with wide-eyed fascination, some even smirking because for years they had endured her petty fines, her threats, her controlling attitude, and now they were watching her being treated not as the queen of the block, but as a suspect in a federal assault case. The colonel ordered her detained for questioning, and though she resisted, flailing and screaming about her rights as HOA president, the soldiers and local police worked together to secure her, placing her in cuffs and leading her toward a patrol car, while neighbors recorded every second, their phones catching her shrieks of, "This isn't over. I'll sue you all. You can't do this to me." But her words were drowned out by the thrum of idling engines and the quiet authority of military command, and as she was shoved into the back seat, the colonel turned back to my wife with a rare softness in his voice, saying, "Ma'am, you're safe now, but this will be escalated to the appropriate channels," which I knew was code for a legal battle that would extend far beyond our sleepy cul-de-sac. Yet even as Karen was driven away, her fate sealed for the moment, the tension didn't dissipate. Because if there's one thing I had learned from my wife's service stories, it was that the first response is never the last, and the presence of 5 military convoys meant that something bigger was unfolding, something Karen had accidentally tripped into, and the next chapter of this conflict was only beginning to reveal itself as the colonel gathered his officers and began issuing quiet but firm orders, orders that made every neighbor lean in and whisper nervously, realizing that the showdown wasn't over yet, but only escalating. As the patrol car carrying Karen disappeared down the street, the cul-de-sac remained in stunned silence, the kind of silence that only follows after something so shocking and surreal that everyone present struggles to process it. Yet the low hum of the military convoys idling at the curb reminded us all that this was far from over, because the colonel wasn't packing up to leave, he was setting up command, and soon more soldiers unloaded crates, communication gear, and tactical maps as if they were preparing to establish a temporary forward operating post right in the middle of suburbia, a sight so bizarre that neighbors leaned out of windows and stepped cautiously onto their lawns, whispering among themselves about whether they were safe, whether this was a drill, or whether Karen's insanity had finally awakened something much larger than the HOA. My wife, though still favoring her bruised shoulder, insisted on standing with the colonel as he briefed the local police chief, who had arrived after being called in by his officers and now looked completely out of his depth, his eyes darting between the military personnel, the crowd of gawking residents, and the classified-looking documents spread across the hood of a Humvee, documents my wife clearly recognized because she leaned in and whispered a few words to the colonel, who nodded sharply before adjusting the perimeter to ensure no curious civilian got too close, which only heightened the neighborhood's unease. Whispers floated through the air like wildfire. "Did you see that convoy? Why were they already here? What's in those trucks?" And soon those whispers turned into full speculation, with some neighbors siding with my wife, muttering that Karen had finally reaped what she had sown, while others nervously wondered if they had somehow stumbled into a national security operation that none of them were supposed to witness. But through it all, my wife remained composed, her voice calm but commanding as she assured neighbors who approached that they were not in danger, that the soldiers were only here temporarily, though she avoided explaining too much because of the classified nature of her advisory role, leaving just enough mystery to keep people both reassured and on edge at the same time. Meanwhile, Karen's absence didn't end the chaos. If anything, it magnified it, because several of her closest allies in the HOA, emboldened by years of her intimidation and manipulation, marched out of their homes to confront the colonel directly, their leader, a balding man with a clipboard who puffed out his chest and declared that as HOA vice president, he demanded to know the military's paperwork of approval for staging in their neighborhood, which made the colonel turn his head ever so slightly, his expression flat and unamused, before replying in a tone colder than steel, "Son, the only paperwork you need to worry about is the report I file if you interfere with federal operations." A statement so sharp and final that the man visibly shrank, his clipboard trembling in his hands. Yet still he tried to mutter something about home values until a soldier quietly stepped between him and the colonel, the subtle warning in his presence enough to silence any further argument. Other neighbors, however, weren't cowed but emboldened, pointing at my wife accusingly and shouting that she had brought all this upon them, that her connections were dragging their peaceful community into a nightmare. And though my wife listened with patience, I could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire she used to describe when she recounted dealing with hostile villagers overseas who didn't understand why American forces had arrived in their town. And finally, she raised her voice, her tone cutting through the panic. "This isn't about you. This isn't about your lawns or your fences. This is about law and order." And a woman who thought she was above it just assaulted a federal officer in her own arrogance. And the sharp silence that followed was heavy, because though many of the neighbors wanted to argue, they couldn't deny the truth of her words, not with the memory of Karen's shoved still fresh in their minds and in the countless videos already circulating on phones. Then, as if to punctuate her statement, several more black SUVs rolled into the cul-de-sac, these marked with federal insignias, and out stepped agents in suits carrying briefcases and secure laptops, their presence making even the bravest of the HOA allies scatter back toward their porches like scolded children, because this wasn't just the military anymore. It was federal investigators, the kind who didn't show up unless something serious was at play, and as they conferred with the colonel and my wife, I could see the story broadening into something far greater than a neighborhood squabble, something tied to national security, and it made me realize that Karen's shove had merely been the spark to ignite a powder keg of consequences. The investigators quickly set up a temporary base of operations in our garage with my wife's permission, wires and laptops humming as they pulled up satellite maps and encrypted files, while soldiers guarded the perimeter, keeping curious residents at bay. And I watched as more and more neighbors gathered in little clusters, their conversations shifting from fear to gossip to awe. Some of them actually thrilled at the idea of living in the middle of a real-life action movie, others deeply unsettled by the fact that their quiet lives had been upended overnight. But, regardless of their feelings, none could deny that the power dynamic of the neighborhood had shifted permanently because the HOA's grip, once unchallenged thanks to Karen's ruthless intimidation, was now shattered by the weight of military boots and federal badges. The whispers grew louder as people speculated about Karen's fate, some claiming she would face jail time, others predicting she would try to sue the government itself. And while I silently laughed at their theories, the reality was far more grim for her, because as my wife explained quietly to me while the colonel stepped aside, Karen wasn't just facing an assault charge. Her actions, recorded on half a dozen phones, combined with her interference in an active federal operation, meant she could be charged with obstruction, endangerment, and even more severe counts once the legal team finished stacking the charges, meaning she wouldn't just lose her HOA presidency, she might lose her freedom for years. But the more pressing issue wasn't Karen herself. It was what her meddling had exposed. Because as the colonel later admitted in a hushed conversation, the convoys hadn't been coincidentally scheduled to meet here. They had been assigned to my wife specifically for a classified directive, and Karen's assault had forced them to accelerate certain operational measures, measures that could no longer remain invisible to the civilian population, which meant the neighborhood had inadvertently become part of a federal-level event, one that couldn't simply be brushed away. And as dusk began to fall, the glow of floodlights lit up our street, casting long shadows across manicured lawns as soldiers set up overnight security. Neighbors shut their blinds tight, and I realized that the coming hours would test not only Karen's future, but the stability of the entire community, because once the federal machine begins to turn, it doesn't stop until every last detail is accounted for, and Karen had just become the unwilling centerpiece of an investigation that was spiraling into something no one could have anticipated. The night that followed felt like something pulled straight out of a war zone rather than a sleepy suburban block, with generators humming, soldiers on watch at every corner, and federal agents moving in and out of my garage turn command center while neighbors peeked through curtains. Their quiet community transformed into a stage for consequences none of them had ever imagined. And as the hours dragged on, updates trickled in about Karen's situation. She had been transported to the county holding facility, booked under multiple charges, and placed under observation after a spectacular meltdown in which she screamed at the deputies about how she ran the government of the neighborhood and would personally fire every soldier for trespassing. Claims so delusional that even the most sympathetic neighbors began to distance themselves from her reputation. And by the next morning, when dawn painted the street gold, the balance of power had shifted completely because the HOA board, members who once strutted around handing out citations were now huddled on their porches, avoiding eye contact, while residents who had suffered years of fines, warnings, and harassment were emboldened to speak out, some even approaching my wife and quietly thanking her for standing up against Karen long before this incident, admitting that her courage had given them the strength to finally resist the HOA's bullying. Meanwhile, the military operation pressed forward, soldiers rotating shifts, while federal agents finalized their investigation, and though many details were withheld from me, I gathered enough from overheard conversations to understand that Karen's meddling had accidentally disrupted a sensitive coordination exercise tied to national security, which meant her assault wasn't just a neighborhood crime. It was officially classified as obstruction of a federal operation, a charge that carried consequences far heavier than any petty assault charge could, and when I watched the colonel brief his superiors over a secure line, his clipped words confirmed my suspicion that Karen's name would be echoing in government records for a long time, not as an HOA president, but as a cautionary tale of civilian arrogance colliding with military authority. As word spread, news vans eventually arrived, circling the block like vultures, trying to capture footage of the convoys and the commotion, and though soldiers quickly pushed them back, it was too late. The story had hit the local press, and soon enough, national outlets began running headlines like HOA president arrested after assaulting military officer during federal operation, and suburban showdown. Neighborhood squabble escalates into military intervention, and while the media frenzy unsettled some neighbors, it also exposed the absurdity of Karen's reign to the world, turning her from a feared local tyrant into a meme shared across social platforms, with people mocking her attempt to claim jurisdiction over armored convoys and federal agents, as if she were some sort of dictator of a cul-de-sac. The more attention the story got, the more neighbors began to reflect on the years of control they had lived under, and by the end of the week, a petition circulated not just to remove Karen as president, which was a moot point now that she was sitting in a jail cell, but to dissolve the HOA altogether, arguing that its structure had enabled her abuse of power for too long, and to my surprise, the momentum built rapidly, signatures piling up until the majority had spoken, effectively ending the HOA's grip on the neighborhood in a single decisive act of democracy, a victory that felt surreal given how untouchable Karen had seemed only days earlier. My wife, though praised as a hero, remained humble, brushing off compliments with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced far greater battles overseas. But I could see the relief in her eyes, the relief of finally being free from Karen's constant harassment, the relief of knowing that justice, both legal and poetic, had been served, and the relief of seeing the community finally reclaim its independence. Still, the military's presence lingered for several more days, wrapping up the classified aspects of their mission, and though I never learned the full details, I understood enough to realize that Karen's actions had forced them to adapt quickly and that her interference had been a dangerous reminder of how unchecked civilian arrogance could compromise serious operations. But when the last convoy eventually rolled out, leaving behind only tire tracks in the asphalt and a neighborhood forever changed, the silence that followed was different, not the tense, fearful silence of before, but a calm, liberating silence, the kind that comes when a long storm has finally broken and the sky clears. As for Karen, her downfall was swift and merciless. The videos of her shoving my wife, screaming at soldiers, and demanding HOA approval for military convoys went viral, ensuring her name became synonymous with entitlement and overreach, while the court swiftly denied her bail after federal prosecutors highlighted the severity of her obstruction charges, and her allies abandoned her one by one, fearful of being dragged into the storm, leaving her isolated, disgraced, and powerless, her once feared clipboard authority reduced to nothing more than a cautionary punchline across the nation. Months later, when the legal dust settled, Karen was sentenced not just to fines and probation, but to actual jail time. Her conviction a stark reminder that no self-proclaimed title, be it HOA president or otherwise, grants someone the right to assault or obstruct. And when neighbors spoke of her, it was always in past tense, as though she had been a bad dream they had collectively awoken from. While life on our street slowly returned to normal, only this time without the constant shadow of HOA inspections or Karens. Shrill voice dictating how tall the grass should be. Standing on my porch one evening, hand in hand with my wife, I realized how quickly everything had changed, how a single shove born of arrogance had unraveled years of intimidation, toppled an entire system of petty control, and brought about a justice more thorough than anyone could have imagined. And though I knew the memory of armored convoys and soldiers in our cul-de-sac would never fully fade, it no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like a turning point, the moment our neighborhood broke free, and for us, it was the moment Karen's downfall became our liberation.